You are listening to the Mother of All Talk Shows podcast with George Galloway.
If you're going to set out to kill a king, you better bring back a body. Well, John Landsman, the exceedingly rich man who owns Momentum, the Labour Party ginger group, set out to kill, well, perhaps not a king, a prince, a rather shabby one about whose shoulders his robes fall increasingly loose, but a prince of sorts, the deputy leader of the Labour Party, Tom Watson. He sprung a surprise, did John Landsman, on Friday night, introducing without notice, including without notice to Watson, that he was going to introduce a motion to abolish the post of Labour's deputy leader, a position that had lasted for 100 years. So, not a small ambition, that motion, Mr. Landsman. And you would have thought that some consultation, maybe even some debate, was necessary before such an ambush was laid and sprung. But not a bit of it. Even Jeremy Corbyn, who would of course have to face the consequences of John Landsman's little manoeuvre, even he didn't know about it. Worse than that, the National Executive assumed that he did know about it and that he was behind it. Cue widespread panic throughout the land. The mass media went into a paroxysm, shedding tears for the brutal way in which Mr. Watson was being treated. The same mass media that has cheered on every backstabbing act by Tom Watson against the twice elected leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn. Well, crocodile or not, the tears were running down their collective faces. And the backlash amongst the Blairite, I was going to call it a rump, but actually it's far too big to be a rump, bigger than Mr. Watson's rump these days, bigger even than John Landsman's rump. It's not a rump, it's a ramp. It is the majority of Labour MPs who support Mr. Blair and Mr. Watson, who, despite their checkered history, are now very much new best friends. Every week, Tom Watson goes in to see Tony Blair. Did you know that? I happen to. Almost from the horse's mouth. The Blairite backlash in the unions and amongst the MPs was such that Mr. Corbyn was forced to crash into reverse gear, cancel that last announcement, and announce something quite different. He was even forced to say on camera how much he enjoyed working with Tom Watson, the deputy leader of the Labour Party. Now, if you believe that, I've got a bridge here in London that I can sell you. It's a great pity that this attempt was mounted, but were it to be mounted, 'twere better that it were done quickly and efficiently. All that's happened is that Mr. Corbyn has been reduced, Mr. Watson has been fortified, and the media got an excuse that they probably didn't need, to be honest, to run 48 hours of extremely damaging coverage of the beginning of the Labour Party conference, to which, of course, Mr. Watson has been contributing mightily on the fringe and any time he sees a camera and or a microphone. A very, very bad start to the Labour Party conference, made worse by the sight this morning of a group of Britain's most prosperous people, jewellery jangling, with their Waitrose groceries sticking out of their expensive handbags, even the women. And on the march they were in Brighton. Their clothes from Savile Row, their clothes from the ritziest shops in London. They marched demanding a people's vote on Brexit. Now, we've been across this course many, many times on the mother of all talk shows. And it would have just been another soft shoe shuffle of the Waitrose Brigade, except right at the front of it was Labour's shadow Foreign Secretary, Lady Nuggie. That's her real name. Emily Thornberry is the professional name that she goes by in Parliament, but she'll always be Lady Nuggie to me. A real live lady bedecked in the flag of the European Union. I mean the flag. I mean a blue top with gold stars around the neck, making it clear that whatever the Labour Party conference decides this week, its Foreign Secretary, no less, should Labour win the general election, would be campaigning to remain in the European Union. And to call that a campaign for a people's vote is a perversity that the English language may not be able to bear. Because what of course it does is reverse the people's vote there already has been. A people's vote that recorded a majority of nearly 1.5 million to leave the European Union, a decision which has never been implemented. But Lady Nuggie is very clear. Whatever the deal, she, imagine, negotiates. She's going to go as the Foreign Secretary to Brussels, try and negotiate a deal that she is going to oppose in a new referendum when she comes back. Now, Jeremy Corbyn has been fighting. Jeremy Corbyn and some of his inner circle, who got the full treatment in the Sunday Times today, drawn up like a Soviet-era poster of Marx, Engels, Lenin and Stalin. Well, there they were, Andrew Murray, Seamus Milne, some fellow, young fellow, Schneider, James Schneider, and one or two others, a panoply of supposed Bolsheviks. They've all been fighting hard to avoid the worst disaster of the Labour Party policy, namely that Labour would commit itself in advance to opposing its own deal. Because anybody with 2 brain cells knows just how stupid that's going to look. And at the time of this broadcast, it seems that Mr. Corbyn has prevailed over Lady Nuggie, and Jeremy Corbyn will negotiate a deal with the EU, and he'll put it to yet another referendum in which Remain will be one of the options on the ballot paper. But at least he intends to remain neutral, just like Harold Wilson back in the referendum of 1975. And that's barely tolerable as a policy, I say to you, as someone who would give their right arm to see Jeremy Corbyn in number 10 Downing Street. My left one too, and I mean that. It's barely tolerable. It's absurd. It's completely wrong, but it can barely be tolerated, except for this. Not only is Lady Nuggie going to campaign against her own deal, so is the then Chancellor of the Exchequer, John MacDonnell, the erstwhile Trotskyite, who has reinvented himself as a Remainer at heart. So is Diane Abbott. Imagine. She's so loyal to Jeremy Corbyn, whose front bench is the only one she would ever be allowed to sit on, that she's opposing his policy too. And Keir Starmer, by then the Brexit Secretary in the British Cabinet. They're all telling you in advance that whatever Jeremy Corbyn thinks or says, whatever the Labour conference thinks or decides, they are going to campaign for remaining in the EU, whatever the deal they manage to negotiate with Brussels, which makes Mr. Corbyn's policy otherwise barely tolerable, utterly ridiculous, because Labour cannot possibly negotiate a good deal if they've told the EU in advance that whatever the deal is, they're going to campaign against it. That's a recipe not for a good deal, but for a very bad deal, so that the choice is for the worst possible deal or remaining in the EU. It's called heads I win, tails you lose. And that's only the beginning of the Labour Party conference, which is only just actually officially kicking off. Now, there are many other, I happen to know, many other good policies that Labour intends to introduce if it is elected as the government in the general election, which cannot now be long delayed. But I'm afraid that even for me, it's impossible to concentrate on them, because the elephant, the herd of elephants that are, I'm not referring to Lady Nuggie here, that are sitting in the room is the Brexit issue. Now, as I've said to you many times, the vast majority of Labour-held constituencies voted leave in the referendum. The vast majority of Labour's target seats, i.e. the ones they need to hope to win in the general election, voted leave, in both cases, by the way, often by enormous majorities, much higher than the national poll of 52 to 48. And it goes without saying that a party which is neither on one side nor on the other of such a nation historic defining issue are not going to successfully walk down the middle of the road. And I say that more in sorrow than in anger. And I hope that that is understood by other supporters of Jeremy Corbyn listening, watching this show tonight. Now, the stories we cover reverberate through the ages, like this one. We first highlighted in great detail with Whitney Webb the grand old Duke of York. John Landsman marched the Labour left to the top of the hill and marched them down again, or Mr. Corbyn was forced to. The grand old Duke of York, Prince Andrew, is in deep, deep trouble, according to the aforementioned Sunday Times. According to the Sunday Times, Mr. Putin is to blame. President Putin has got the goods on our jolly jape, Prince Andrew. We know that because MI6 are on the case. James Bond, 007, Austin Powers, Johnny English, they're all on the case to defend the jolly japer from the ministrations of President Putin and the KGB. Can you believe it? KGB's 30 years dead, but they're in the papers again today. They've got the goods, apparently. It was President Putin that forced Prince Andrew into Ghislaine Maxwell's townhouse to fornicate or not fornicate, depending on who you believe, with a 17-year-old girl who'd been specially trafficked to London for the purpose. At least that's what the girl says, and normally nowadays the girl has to be believed. Prince Andrew vehemently and repeatedly has denied it. But if it's not true, what can Putin have? And if Putin has nothing, why would MI6 now be getting involved? We'll be talking about the Epstein Affair and its interface, if you'll forgive the pun, with the grand old Duke of York. Now, I watched yesterday Leicester City playing Sheffield United. Foreign viewers and listeners may be a little confused as to where I'm going here, but bear with me. The game in question, not Leicester City, forgive me, Everton against Sheffield United. Everton is owned by an Iranian, And Sheffield United is now wholly owned by a Saudi Arabian. You didn't know that, did you? You certainly didn't know that Prince Abdullah, the grandson of the founder of Saudi Arabia, the founder of King Abdulaziz's grandson, is the whole owner of Sheffield United. Just think about that. He was forced, the English co-owner was forced to give him half the club for just £5 million, an English Premiership club. Anyway, it was a great battle between the Iranian owner and the Saudi owner, and the Saudi owner prevailed, won. But I'm asking here, why have I not read that anywhere? Why is there no national controversy over the fact that one of the royal family of Saudi Arabia, who cut my friend Jamal Khashoggi into pieces and flushed him down the drain, a man whose face I kissed many times, whose hand I shook many times, was cut into pieces by the royal family of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia crucifies people almost on a weekly basis. In fact, definitely on a weekly basis. Almost, actually, every other day. They behead people and crucify them almost every other day. They have massacred, are massacring innocents next door in Yemen. The same royal family that now wholly own an English Premiership football club. Why have I not read that anywhere? Why isn't that an issue? If the grandson of Ayatollah Khomeini was about to become the owner of a Premiership football team, do you think you would have heard about it? Saddam Hussein's grandson? Do you think you would have heard about it? Nicolas Maduro's grandson? Vladimir Putin's grandson? Might that have been a matter of national controversy? Well, I intend to make it one. I've never met this prince who's now the owner of Sheffield United, and I have no wish to. But I can't see how a member of the Saudi royal family passes the fit and proper person test for ownership of a Premiership football team. And lastly, and we've got the very best of guests coming up on this. We've been covering the Israeli elections. We cover what happens in Israel, Palestine, all the time. Prime Minister Netanyahu took a big gamble. He had to, because if he couldn't secure his position as Prime Minister, he might well be headed for jail. He took a big gamble, called a second general election within 5 months, and lost it. So is it the end for Netanyahu? Will he go to prison now? Or will he flee into exile somewhere now? And who will come after him? And will that person be any better, just as worse, or even worse than Netanyahu is? I know you find that hard to believe, but trust me, there are people in the Israeli political class who are indeed even worse than Netanyahu. But we've got the oracle himself. He is the doyen of Israeli journalists, Haaretz columnist Gideon Levy, and he is on the line now. Gideon, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
So great to be with you again, George.
It's fantastic. I love to hear your voice and get your wisdom. Let's start with the nuts and bolts. 33 to 31. The president now has to choose which of these two men is best able to form a stable coalition, maybe even the two of them together, or at least the two parties together. Where are we? What stage are we at in that horse trading now?
Right now, we are stuck in a deadlock and at least one party out of new parties will have to give up its principles in order to solve this deadlock. Otherwise, we might find ourselves again in another election, the third one within few months. But it is just the beginning today, and it will be a long way to go. And finally, I guess they will compromise like politicians do.
Let me ask about a general election. He has, I think, 3 weeks to complete this process. How would the Israeli public take to a third general election? Was the turnout in this second one any less than the first one, and would the third one therefore likely have an even smaller turnout?
The turnout in the second was bigger than the first because people really wanted to put an end to it once and for all. And but if this will not work, I think there will be a lot of frustration in Israel over the question that the system is not working, because finally it is all stuck because Benjamin Netanyahu is not ready to step down, because he's the only obstacle now to any kind of government. This man faces few charges, very heavy charges, and in any normal place he would now go and deal with his personal things and release the political system from his presence, at least until he will be found guilty or found clean. But, you know, to carry this whole state to one campaign after the other only to find a way from jail, this is far too much even for Israelis.
And Gantz ran on that, didn't he? And it seems to me, I mean, I take your point about politicians and horse trading, but it seems to me Gantz cannot go into government with a man that he has been calling a crook and demanding that he face justice, alleging, as you just perfectly summed up, that all of this paralysis is because of the pending criminal charges against Netanyahu. And yet Gantz's demand that Netanyahu stand down from the leadership of Likud, which would allow both of these parties to come together in a big, grand national coalition. He can't compromise on that, can he, Gantz?
Gantz can compromise on anything except of sitting together with Netanyahu, because he is quite committed to this, and his voters will never forgive him if he will join Netanyahu's government. This is not an option for him. It might be an option for him that Netanyahu will serve in his government, but then Netanyahu will not go for it, because for Netanyahu it's either being a prime minister or going to jail. I mean, if he will be just a minister, he will have to resign by law, and then the whole thing will look different from his point of view. So both of them are in front of a deadlock, and who knows who will solve it, but I'm sure it will be solved.
Now, let me ask you about someone who scares the horses, metaphorically speaking. I don't actually have any horses, but scares the horses in my house, Gideon. Avigdor Lieberman. He can be the kingmaker in certain permutations of this new political situation. Tell the listeners and viewers, would you, how he did and why I might be scared of him.
You should be scared of him because he's the most cynical politician in Israel. And believe me, the competition is not an easy one. But by far, he is the most cynical, the most brutal one, the most corrupted one, much more than Netanyahu, even though he doesn't face any trial. And he became the kingmaker because he decided to play this game and to leave the right-wingers, which he belongs to, and to play for a moment the kingmaker. But I don't know for how long will it last. Right now he holds the cards very close to his chest, so close that even he cannot see the cards. And I'm not sure that he knows where does he go to. He just enjoys, above all, to torture Netanyahu, who is a rival, and there is a lot of bad blood between those two men. And by the way, also to incite again against the Palestinians as he did today in a very ugly way. And he enjoys it, and he just gains more power out of it, and that's really, really annoying.
Now, tell me if I've got this right. His beef, well, he has personal beef with Netanyahu, but one of the political things he has against Netanyahu is Netanyahu's dependence on the extremely religious forces in the country. Lieberman may be an extremely right-wing, hawkish individual, but he's also, his voting base is secular. And one of the reasons he broke from Netanyahu was this question of secular versus religious. Gantz is also secular. Most of his voting base is secular. Does that mean it's more likely for Lieberman to go into coalition with Gantz?
George, I'm not sure you need me. You know so much and you understand so much better than I do.
Not at all.
No, seriously, I mean, the level of knowledge is really impressive because you are getting into a resolution that even most of Israelis don't do. In any case, that's really a point. But with Lieberman, you gave him more credit than he deserves. Because you describe Lieberman as someone who follows some idea, some ideology. Again, Lieberman is interested only in power, and really he brought cynicism to the highest level that you can think about. He builds all his career on hatred. He just changes the targets of his hatred. So once he incites against the Palestinians, and then when it's not good enough, he will incite against the religious ones, against the Orthodox, and he can very easily then compromise with the Orthodox and go back to incite against the Palestinians, as he just did today. Today, all of a sudden, he say, no, we have some problems with the Orthodox, but the Palestinians are the enemy. So I wouldn't get into the ideology of Mr. Lieberman because it doesn't exist. For him, it's really only to enjoy those power games and to feel that he is on the horse. You mentioned horses before. To feel that he is on the horse and someone else is not on the horse. By the end of the day, if you ask me, he will do anything possible to get rid of Netanyahu, but he will not leave the right-wing camp because finally he is a right-winger, a fascist, a racist, you name it.
Yeah. Tell me about the so-called Arab parties. How did they do in the election, and what role, if any, will they play in this horse trading?
This is the most fascinating part of this campaign because they got reunited, as you know, in these elections, which they were not 5 months ago. And they did so well that they became the third party in Israel's parliament.
Wow.
They are not yet accepted as a legitimate part of the political life in Israel, but today they made a huge step toward legitimizing themselves by recommending the president to nominate Benny Gantz. They never did it before. They never recommended the Zionists to become prime minister. They did it today, as they explained it, because the real threat is Benjamin Netanyahu, and they'll do anything possible to get rid of Netanyahu, even supporting another Zionist general who had the record, quite a bloody record in Gaza, but they put everything aside, and only in the sake of getting rid of Netanyahu, they were ready to recommend Gantz. By this, they became much more influential because all of a sudden they are part of the game. I hope that Gantz will react in return by taking them also, accepting them as a legitimate partner, which they were not until today.
Let me give out the telephone numbers, Gideon, before we continue, if that's all right. The US number is 001-757-744-4480. And the UK number is 0207-798-2255. And you can tweet, of course, at George Galloway, at GGMoats, at RT UK News. Gideon, let's talk about the near abroad to you. How we read in the week that the Russian Air Force had scrambled and stopped the Israeli Air Force from further attacking targets inside Syria. How are things on the Lebanese front, which a week or so ago looked like war, but that might have just been pre-election showboating by the Israeli government? Is the war front calmed now, I suppose, is what I'm asking?
The front is calm now, but this does not mean that the danger of war is gone. Look, there are many things that we know, but there are many more things that we don't know. And Israel's activity in Syria and Lebanon and Iraq and all around Iran, I think there is much more misinformation, disinformation than real information. We know that Israel is very active. We know that until now, except of here and there some Russian warnings, Israel had a carte blanche to act quite freely. Nobody stopped Israel, and nobody took any retaliation. So where will it lead? When will be the stage in which it will all explode, or maybe not? Only time will show. Right now it's calm, but you see what's going on in the Persian Gulf. I don't know how much Israel is involved there, but we know that Israel is everywhere. So time will show. Where will it lead? Will it lead to another war, maybe even an overall war, which I'm not sure it will, because nobody has a real interest for this? Or will it be another one of those tense period, and then it will be calm again? But as you know even better than I do, no problem was solved until now, so tension will be around.
Well, I mean, I'm going to do a slot later about what happened on this day in various years, and it turns out that in this week of 1995, Israel and Palestine agreed self-rule on the West Bank, and the historic handshake took place between Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat. Deja vu. The issue in 1995, and this is almost 2020, is no better now at the end, coming towards the end of 2019, than it was in 1995. Not only has nothing been solved, in some respects things have gone backwards, Gideon.
Absolutely. I mean, we are in a much worse situation today than in 95. The occupation is much stronger, much more well-based. The world is less interested. The Palestinians are weaker and more divided and bleeding from the Second Intifada. The Arab world is preoccupied with other issues rather than the Palestinian problem. So everything seems now much less hopeful than 20, 25 years ago, no doubt about it. And even the facts in the ground. You know, George, that the number of settlers ever since 95 tripled, even not doubled, but tripled. And we reach a stage in which one should realize that this is almost an irreversible reality, 700,000 settlers.
I used to, back in those days, I used to regularly travel to Tel Aviv. In fact, I lived in the Shankin street in Tel Aviv for many months at a time back in the day, in the 80s, in the early 90s. I had many, many friends that were active in the in the opposition, the peace movement, Yesh Gavul, and many other peace organizations, justice organizations. I used to dine with Shulamit Aloni, and there were quite a number, not that many, but quite a number of Israeli members of the Knesset who were genuinely searching for a solution and so on. All of that seems to have died away. I sometimes think you're the last man standing in Israel.
No, that's not true, because there are still quite few NGOs and other political groups, young people and old people, who really struggle. We'll just mention Breaking the Silence and Physicians for Human Rights and Anarchists Against the Fence and B'Tselem and Ta'ayus and Mahsom Watch. I mean, they are there. The only problem is that they are totally delegitimized in Israeli public opinion, and unfortunately they are very small in numbers. When you were in Shenkin Street, even from this perspective, the Israeli peace camp was something much more meaningful than today.
It was many thousands. You know, I've been in Dizengoff Square with them, with thousands of people there.
Absolutely.
That's no longer the case.
I always give the example of the Sabra and Shatila massacre, which took place in the middle of the 80s. The day the massacre took place, the same evening, there were 400,000 Israelis in the Rabin Square, which was not called then Rabin Square. Today, if the same massacre would have taken place, God forbid, I'm not sure there would be 400 Israelis going to protest, and even I'm not sure there would be 40.
Well, it's sobering. Last question, and I'm grateful for your time, Gideon. Last question. Where does Donald Trump fit into all this? He seemed to be the BFF, best friend forever, of Benjamin Netanyahu. And yet I read today that now that he's in trouble, Donald Trump's looking away. Have you got any further and better particulars on that?
Donald Trump cannot stand weakness. He's always against the weak ones, we know it. And when he smells weakness, he turns his back. And that's exactly what he had done, quite in a brutal way, I must say, to Benjamin Netanyahu. Even Vladimir Putin was nicer to Netanyahu in this campaign than Donald Trump. Once he realized that Netanyahu might not deliver the goods, is not the magician that he thought that he is, immediately he changed his tone. Not yet, it's not fatal yet, because Netanyahu still might be prime minister, but Netanyahu cannot count on him, and Netanyahu is going to learn a lesson, because Netanyahu really gambled on the friendship, so-called, with Donald Trump as his biggest asset, and all of a sudden, nothing is left.
It's been a privilege talking to you for such a length of time. Gideon Levy, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the mother of all talk shows. The proximate cause of the immediate spike in tension and danger was a highly successful drone attack on Saudi Arabia's biggest oil refinery, which cost them half of their production. I'm not sure for how long, but it severely disrupted their production and distribution of oil, caused a spike in world oil prices and a panic in the breasts of business people and politicians all over the world, especially when Donald Trump responded by saying the United States was locked and loaded. Now, in the United States, that's usually a prelude to opening fire. So naturally we thought, even though John Bolton had just a day before departed, that the shooting was about to start. And we're not talking about a shooting in one of those saloons where the door swings open and shut in the Westerns. We're talking about a shooting that would have set half the world on fire. So some of us went to bed that night extremely worried that there was going to be a war between the United States and its allies and its satrapies in the Persian Gulf, places like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, and the Islamic Republic, and by extension, its friends all over the world, too. Scary thought. Well, it seems to have abated, or has it? I'm joined by Britain's best, I think, Britain's best expert on all things Iranian. He's a broadcaster and journalist, Robert Carter, who the lucky amongst you will have seen on my Sputnik television show just yesterday on RT. Robert, great to see you again.
Pleasure to be on. Thank you.
Let's get into a bit more detail than we were able to in the short time we had on television. Isn't this the conundrum? If, as the United States and Saudi Arabia say, Iran did it, then isn't the conclusion or the answer, well, imagine what else they could do if they did that with one set of drones on one night? And if that put oil prices up around the world, imagine if all guns were blazing. Or if it was the Houthis that did it, then hadn't you better bring that war to a close before they do it again and again and again and again? They're in a cleft stick, the Saudis and their allies, on this, aren't they?
Yes, I think that's a fair assessment to make. And I think that one of the reasons that the Saudis and their allies, including the United States, are so eager to point the finger at Iran is simply because that very point that you raised about the fact that, you know, this war in Yemen is escalating, it's not achieving any of their objectives and things like that, is very, very true. And that question, of course, brings into the greater context of why is Saudi Arabia attacking the country, who's supporting Saudi Arabia in their war on Yemen, and things like that. And, of course, that would implicate the US more. The UK as well also has a major role in supporting Saudi Arabia's coalition on Yemen. So I suspect, looking at all the evidence that we've seen so far, that the attack did come from Yemen, in my professional opinion. The Saudis have actually admitted, the foreign minister was interviewed just a few hours ago, and he did acknowledge the fact that they still, at this stage, do not know if the drones were actually launched from Iranian territory or not. They say that it was from the north and continue to discredit the Yemeni narrative that it came from Yemen. But this is where I think the Saudis are being disingenuous, and I think the US is supporting them on that because they know that if they admit that this was a successful Yemeni resistance strike, then of course this completely opens the door to all the questions and scrutiny about what the heck is Saudi Arabia doing in Yemen, why is it committing, in my opinion, genocide there, and did they deserve to get struck back? I mean, the Yemenis see it as retaliatory strikes.
Not a single human being was killed in this drone strike on the oil refinery, unlike the ceaseless, for 5 years, the ceaseless bombardment by Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, guided, on-site, guided by British and American officers, which have killed well over 100,000, maybe hundreds of thousands of Yemenis, caused famine, cholera, polio, widespread starvation and total absence of medicines and so on. That didn't make it onto the news much, but a casualty-free strike by the Yemeni resistance turned the world upside down.
And that's what's so upsetting and outrageous about it. The fact of the matter is, you know, if the latest UN reports on the situation in Yemen have made very, very clear that, you know, Saudi Arabia and their coalition actions are the biggest contributor towards deaths in the country. As you rightly said, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of deaths. The UN is predicting that if things go on the way they are, that over 250,000 people will be dead in Yemen as a result of this war. And I think we can all agree that this is a Saudi-led effort, backed by the US and backed by the UK. Why are they pointing the finger at Iran? What does this really have to do with Iran? The evidence doesn't really suggest conclusively that the Iranians had any involvement in it, but they're adamant that it was the Iranians, that we have to look at the Iranians, we have to sanction the Iranians. The Iranians and the Yemenis both say the same thing. Stop talking about Iran, the Persian Gulf, this and that. Talk more about the Yemen. Bring the Yemen war to an end and stop all of this ceaseless destruction and besieging of the country.
But you see my point. If it was Iran, that just shows you the kind of, that gives you a slightest taste, foretaste of what Iran can do. In which case, why are you constantly appearing to be going to war with Iran if Iran has the capability of causing absolute destruction in the whole of the region?
Absolutely, and I think that, you know, to emphasize that point that you're rightly making, Iran has a lot more military capabilities.
A lot more than drones.
Absolutely, than the oppressed Yemenis have at the moment. They've been preparing for what they've suspected is going to be a war in Iran for decades, since the revolution of 1979 succeeded and brought the US-backed dictatorship out of power. They've been preparing for what the US is going to do. They're ready for it. They're not, you know, as I've said previously, playing silly games on Twitter with Trump, sending, you know, useless little messages. They are very, very serious. And when they say that we're ready for an all-out war if you attack us, they really, really mean it. So the US foreign policy is obviously chaotic. It's very damaging to the world. But I think what we've really got to focus on here is that this Western narrative of blaming Iran for everything that's going on in the region, blaming them for all of Saudi's foreign policy decisions, their attacks on Yemen, you know, their attacks on Lebanon's democracy and things like that, all these other issues. This is just a scapegoat for them to get away with what is murder in Yemen, for example. And this is why I think we have to combat this Western narrative, which lacks the evidence to support it, and we have to divert attention away from this US anti-Iran policy. You know, it's the Iranians, you know, they're actually playing a positive role in the region. This is what a lot of people don't realise, and perhaps the only advice I can give to the viewers is, you know, look behind the headlines, focus on what the Iranians are actually doing, what they're actually saying. Listen to their foreign ministry, speaks very good English. Listen to what they're saying. The UN are meeting next week. Iran is preparing to speak there. They have a lot of plans about how they should deal with this Persian Gulf crisis that they're going to be discussing during that meeting. Saudi Arabia will also be there as well, and they're probably going to ramp up their anti-Iran rhetoric, as they usually do, blame Iran for all of their issues and things like that. But how much is the Yemen war going to be discussed, especially by world leaders who have the power to stop it?
They want to talk about anything. But let's take a call from Alex in Manchester on this subject. Alex, welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me, Joe.
Welcome, sir.
Second time on your show, and thank you very much for your hard work.
Thank you.
News channels don't do justice. You should be on one of these big news channels doing exactly what you do.
RT is the biggest news channel out there. It's the biggest in the Arab world. It's the biggest in Latin America. We're broadcasting to the whole world here, Alex, so don't feel sorry for me.
Okay. Regarding this whole thing, that incident in Saudi Arabia, I just want to point out a couple of things. First of all, your guess that you have, Mr. Carter, is pretty accurate with what you said, and I agree with pretty much everything that you said. You did mention that nobody was killed, which is a very important point. The IPO of Ramco that's going to be going on the stock market, that's another thing that's who's going to benefit from this whole attack. Now, the beneficial of this attack, it can only either be Yemen or Saudi Arabia. I very much doubt that Iran had anything to do with it. But let's just presume, for the sake of argument, Iran did even have anything to do with it. Saudi Arabia is the fifth largest defense budget in the world. How is some country that has got so many sanctions is able to produce some sort of weapon that can deter every radar in Saudi Arabia?
It's a very, very good question. I was going to ask it of Robert later anyway, Alex, so thanks for bringing it up. Robert, that point is really important, isn't it? That Iran is supposedly being sanctioned to the point of expiring, and Saudi Arabia has spent I don't know how many hundreds of billions of dollars on weapons of war and defensive shields and so on. Isn't one of the takeaways of this that really the Saudis have been taken for a ride by the arms manufacturers? If a set of drones can bring your oil industry to a halt, what's the point of Patriot missiles and anti-missile missiles and these kind of shields and all this expensive paraphernalia?
You know, Yemen is known as the graveyard of empires, and I think that it's earned that title over many years. And I think right now Saudi Arabia is starting to get a taste of that. I think you're absolutely right. I think that Saudi Arabia is being taken for a ride. I think that they've become essentially a glorified proxy power for the US in the region, and they value that relationship so much. But the US has proven time and time again that they're not a reliable ally to all of these Arab nations.
Netanyahu just found that out in the last 48 hours.
Well, there's another example there, and I think that, you know, obviously we could sit here and say, look, Saudi Arabia, get some sense, realise that what the US is probably advising you to do in the region is not to your best interests. But obviously we don't want to take away the responsibility and the fact that Saudi Arabia is also making these decisions which are costing innocent lives in the region.
Yes, we can't deny their agency. Last word from you, Alex.
Just two things. I thought Afghanistan was a graveyard of all empires.
I was going to say that, but there's quite a few graveyards of empires, thank God.
Just one last thing. Now, if we're expecting Saudi Arabia to tell us the truth, it's almost as stupid as waiting for them to tell the truth about who actually killed Jamal Khashoggi. They changed the story so many times. What's the odds of them actually telling us the truth this time around?
Exactly, yeah, very good point, actually.
Okay.
Thank you
very much for your show.
Alex, you're a gentleman. Thanks a lot. Don't be shy. Come back anytime. I was going to ask one or two other things, Robert, if I may. Alex asked one of them. Instead of being locked and loaded and opening fire, the US are sending more troops to the region instead.
Yeah.
And they seem to be wanting to draw a line under the oil refinery issue. At least that's how it looks to me. They don't fancy a war with Iran because, frankly, it would be a Vietnam style of war. And possibly a duration, and possibly the outcome also. They don't fancy it. Donald Trump's in an election year. He's on an election campaign. He ran last time as the man that would get the US out of foreign wars. And then if he went to war in Iran, he'd be doing something that none of the others were stupid enough to do. So how do you evaluate the US position? And what do you think the impact of large numbers of US forces arriving in what is, after all, the holy land for Muslims? It was one of the original bin Laden demands, which the Saudis succumbed to kick out all American forces from Saudi Arabia, and now they're coming back. What implications do you see in that?
It is scary how little we can learn from history sometimes, isn't it, George? I think that, you know, the US policies for the region have been proven time and time again to be a failure. And I think that what a lot of people are judging them on now is, for example, their anti-Iran policy, which has been described as economic terrorism by Iranian foreign minister and so on. What were the objectives of this foreign policy on Iran? It was to bring Iran to the negotiating table. It's not happening. It was to, you know, perhaps even encourage a regime change push within Iran. That's not going to happen. It's also supposed to curb Iran's role in the region, which clearly isn't happening because they're now playing a more positive role than anything else.
I mean, if Iran did this, then so much for pushing back on its role in the region.
Exactly. And I mean, you know, so many countries are actually starting to look away from the traditional powerhouses of the region, which was, you know, historically the US, to some degree Saudi Arabia and these types of countries. Now they're starting to turn to Iran, they're starting to turn to Russia and China to look for someone who can perhaps guide the region back towards peace and stability. You mentioned earlier about the arms trade that's being fed into Saudi Arabia. these countries are spending millions and millions every year on arming themselves up for some kind of escalation, and it's spilling over and creating catastrophes in Yemen, and we've seen in Bahrain and other countries there's ongoing crises, political crises there, which are being fed in by military occupations and things like that. Iran, on the other hand, is spending far smaller sums. If you listen to what they say as well, the UN meeting in New York that's coming up this week will be a perfect opportunity for our viewers to do that. The Iranians have called time and time again for peace, de-armament of the region, and to stop fueling the conflict by essentially pouring money and arms into that region. It's not what the region needs. It does need support in many ways, I think, and, you know, the West could play a positive role in the region. There's no reason they can't. But right now, they're looking at it as with dollar signs in their eyes. You know, these arms sales and these arms companies, what role they're playing is absolutely disgraceful. And I think, you know, we claim that this is, you know, the heartland of democracy. We're the greatest example of democracy, and we try to export it to the world. Why is it that we're, you know, rather than exporting democracy, we're supporting dictatorships, exporting weapons, and basically we're living off a death economy. And I mean, is that the legacy that we really want? Well, we claim that we don't have that legacy. We claim to be a democratic power in the world. But unfortunately, if you go to Yemen and speak to people on the ground there, or Gaza, for example, or Iraq even, do they see the, you know, the golden idea of democracy there? No, they don't.
Robert Carter, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the mother of all talk shows. Let's take a quick break. In 2020, on the 18th of January, I'll be making my first public appearance in Scotland for quite some time. And of course, there are huge issues, political issues, in Scotland and coming down the pipe for Scotland, like the demand for yet another independence referendum, like the impact of Brexit on Scotland and Scottish politics. So many things to talk about. So you could say it's a homecoming for me. And it's at the East Kilbride Village Theatre. You can get your tickets from the theatre. It's www.sllcboxoffice.co.uk. Now, I can delay no longer turning to Ask Adam, because I've got quite a few important questions for you here, Adam. Liam Ryan, a very, very clever young man in Ireland, says, does Adam feel his version of libertarianism could facilitate a meeting of minds between left and right?
Oh, absolutely, not least because I'm not an...
It has, here.
Quite so, and I'm not a doctrinaire libertarian, because I'm not a doctrinaire anything, but I've always had quite a strong libertarian streak, but my moment of coming out from the Lion, the Witch and the wardrobe and the closet and the rest of it was when I saw Julian Assange dragged out like a beast from the Ecuadorian embassy. I always had strong libertarian leanings, and I've always been very friendly with libertarian-minded people. When I saw that image of Assange being dragged out, something that would shame a tin-pot dictatorship, I decided to wear my libertarian flag on the outside of my sleeve rather than on the inside of my heart, because I think that that was a watershed moment that showed people on the left and the right that if you give government too much power, they'll abuse it. And one day your guy's in, and when he's in, life is just superb. But the next day, either through electoral changes or worse, through some dictatorial, revolutionary, violent change of power, the other guy's going to be in there. And when that happens, you're going to be very miserable. You might be forced to take shelter in a foreign embassy. You might be dragged out of that embassy. You might be stripped of all international status. You might be sent to a prison where throat-cutting terrorists are normally the typical prisoners. I'm, of course, describing what happened to Assange. So I think absolutely. And even though libertarianism tends to, in the last 40 years or so, be associated with the centre-right. One can't forget that Michael Foote described himself as a libertarian socialist, because whilst he did want the government to provide the kinds of economic impetus for change that socialists tend to do, when it came to human relations, he wasn't at all for a kind of Orwellian government. And indeed, his generation of socialists were very much brought up in the wake of Orwell, who challenged the more utopian notions of what government could do. So absolutely, libertarianism is a broad church for anyone who doesn't like power in a concentrated form, and for anyone who fears power, some variety of libertarianism might be for you.
Doesn't libertarianism imply that people can do what they want? I mean, they can take drugs if they want, they could take them in the street if they want, they can behave morally any way that they want. That's what I'm not as clever as you, certainly not as well educated as you, but that's what libertarianism means to me.
If one takes it to that kind of extreme, it becomes what I like to call anarcho-libertarianism. The classic argument that a moderate libertarian uses, and Dr. Ron Paul, who's probably the most famous libertarian in the world, he said that your rights end where my rights begin. Now, drugs are a funny one, because those of a more libertine, which I'm certainly not, in fact, I don't think you could confuse me.
Heaven forfend!
One could never confuse me for that. Someone who's libertine is, let's do it in the road, drugs are wonderful, let's bash our brains in and destroy us. But I see drugs as a crime not just against the self, but against society. And there's so many examples from ISIS on down where drugs are used as a poison to inflict not only degeneracy, but open, bold-faced violence against society. So I would absolutely put drugs in the same category as murder and as theft, which are two things that all but the most insane anarcho-libertarians think that there should be a prohibition against.
Let's hear from George in Cardiff. Wants to ask you about Prince Andrew. Go carefully now, Adam.
Quite so.
George.
Hi there, George.
Hi, go ahead.
Adam.
Go ahead.
How are you?
So I just wanted to talk to you guys about the John Mark Duggan case that's just come out recently, how the MI6 seems to be kind of, helping out cover up this Prince Andrew case.
I don't recognize the name at the beginning, but the Prince Andrew issue, according to the Sunday Times today, is that what you're referring to, George? That the MI6 are on the case because they say it was the Russians that forced Prince Andrew to do anything that he did that was wrong. I'm paraphrasing, but only just.
Yeah, I mean, basically it was a former deputy Palm Beach County Sheriff. He basically resigned and then went over to Russia. And now what they're actually claiming is that he's going to be giving confidential information to the Russians.
A county sheriff?
He worked at the county sheriff's office. He was a former deputy there.
So he'll be passing over details of parking fines and so on. George, thanks. Adam, what's your view on this today's story that James Bond and Johnny English and Austin Powers are all going to work because the KGB, no less, it's come back from the grave.
Zombie KGB.
Yeah.
Complete with eyebrows and all.
Have got the goods on Prince Andrew.
Well, there's only one thing I comment on less than current legal cases, and that's pending legal cases. But I will say this. Obviously, paedophilia is a crime for which I think the death penalty should apply. You have a moral opposition to capital punishment. I tend to offer what I consider my moral justifications for it. In any case, the other thing that I believe in very strongly, and that's gone out of fashion at least since the time of Tony Blair, is the common law presumption of innocence. It's sacred, and not only does it apply in the letter of the law, but I think it ought to apply at a more unspoken ethical level. We all remember that, that Princess Diana was hounded by the press, and there were rumours and innuendo about her personal life, and don't get me wrong, I think her funeral was the moment, disgracefully, that the stiff upper lip gave way to the loose lower hip. And so I'm not at all happy about how Tony Blair and
I said that in terms to my daughter when we were watching it at the time.
Indeed, it was.
What's happened to us?
It was like watching a country burying itself along with the late and tragically killed by circumstance Princess Diana. But we're now getting into a situation where the press is hounding, dare I say, a less popular royal figure, but doing so in a manner that almost approaches that level of invidious vulgarity. And I'm just not for it. Let the law be the law, and anyone is innocent and proven guilty, whether a man, a servant, or a king. And so that's all I'll go into on that level of the matter.
There you go, George. That's us told. Malcolm is in Glasgow. Malcolm.
Hey, George. How are you doing tonight?
Good, thanks. Nice to hear from you. Go on.
Yeah, well, I want to keep it very focused. You talked about a lot tonight. I've been enjoying the chat, but I want to keep it very focused on your opinion. Basically, I want to talk about the SNP, I want to talk about Scotland, and I want to talk about how basically they're asking for independence, but they want to, basically give that away to Europe, give it away to the currency. But not only that, Europe thinks we're a basket case. They think we're worse than Cyprus, we're worse than Greece. I'm seeing more and more potholes in Scotland. I'm seeing higher and higher taxes in Scotland. I'm seeing SNP as a one-trick pony, that they're just fighting for something, taking that idiot black hole in Westminster just to make England so fed up with Scotland that they just want to get rid of it. And I think the SNP are a disgrace to the United Kingdom.
Yeah.
Well, I couldn't have put that better, Malcolm, and I don't often say that. I could not have put that better. I'll just add to it some touches of my own. The education system in Scotland was once world famous. It was certainly renowned throughout Britain as superior to the education system elsewhere in the state. And no one in their right mind, even the SNP, would claim that that is any longer true. The Scottish education system is in a state of steep decline and potential collapse. The National Health Service, ditto. The potholes, the roads, many things. The SNP have been in power for 10 long years. And in those 10 years, practically everything in Scotland has gotten worse. Now, they would say, well, that's because of austerity. But their cuts to public services in Scotland are worse than the cuts made proportionately elsewhere in the country, with more money than was available elsewhere in the country. They've gone for these gimmicks. For example, no tuition fees in Scotland, paid for by the taxpayers in England, who have to pay tuition fees for their children's education. No prescription charges, paid for by the taxpayer in England, who has to pay for prescription charges. I could go on and on, but let's stick to the bigger philosophical point. And you touched on it brilliantly in your introduction. The SNP wants to leave a small union in one island, a small island of English-speaking people, where most of their exports go, with whom most of their trade is conducted, in order to join a farther away union where a babel of 100 languages are spoken, and where Scotland will be an insignificant blip on the European landscape of 5 million people. Moreover, as again you perfectly summed up, one which faces national bankruptcy from day one of any attempt to break away from Britain and begin negotiation with the European Union. Let's deal with some of the salient points of that. According to the fiscal rules of the European Union, Scotland would have to run a deficit in its accounts of no greater than 3% of GDP. But if Scotland left Britain, it would have to have a deficit of about 4 times that, 400% more than that. If Scotland left the pound, which it certainly would have to do, because, as was clear last time, in that once-in-a-generation referendum that we had, the Bank of England, the clue is in the name, will not allow people whom it cannot control to use a currency that belongs then, in those circumstances, to someone else. Meaning that either Scotland will have to invent a new currency in a country with a gigantic deficit from day one, or apply to join the euro. How's that going to go down? How popular amongst the Scottish people will be joining the euro when your economy is comparable with Greece? And even the dimmest know what happened to Greece. A word on that, Adam.
Well, you're absolutely right. All of the issues pertaining to Scotland were very true. Very interestingly, Scotland always excelled in sciences and in medicine, far more than most of Western Europe, far more than England for a great period of time. English universities had a very much philosophical and theological background, but the Scots produced wonderful scientists right up until fairly recent decades, until they gave up science to become fishmongers with salmon, sturgeons, and all the rest of the SNP front bench. But yeah, joining the European Union in a way that's even more immersed in the Brussels tourniquet than what the UK is in is what the SNP policy is. It's something even worse than British membership, and as you say, it's going to be a cold water Greece. It's going to be made into the whipping boy of the Brussels elite. And so if Scotland wants to be independent, let me be clear, I want more referenda across the land, not less. Scotland can hold an independence referendum every year if they want, every 6 months if they really, really want it. But what sort of independence is on offer? If we're talking about referenda with more than 2 choices, there should, frankly, if the SNP are going to be honest, a 3-question referenda. Do you want Scotland to be part of an independent country called the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland? Option 2, do you want Scotland to be an independent country full stop? Or option 3, do you want Scotland to be a dependent of the European superstate? Because that's what the SNP are frankly going for. It's duplicitous.
Joshua is in London on line 2. Joshua, go ahead, sir.
Are you right, George? How are you doing?
Very good, thanks. Thanks for calling.
Yeah, I was just going to say, George, in a way, this, and I know full well that Corbyn, like yourself, doesn't believe in any of this latest bid that he has ostensibly been, sort of helmed at, the second referendum and about, second referendum about with the option to remain in the EU. But I will say, George, that he knows, well, if you know and I know Remain couldn't win a second referendum, you would agree with that, yes?
I do.
Yeah, okay. I'm pretty sure if you've known Corbyn for 40 years, as you claim, and I believe you, I'm pretty sure that Jeremy Corbyn knows that at least as well as you and I do, if not better so. So if he knows that they can't win and that he's going to take an impartial position, I think that's, even though as much as I disagree with his strategy, I do think in the end it doesn't really matter anyway, because if he knows Remain will definitely lose and he takes an impartial position on the outcome and simply wants to find a good deal, then that means that he is basically only trying to implement the will of the people while simultaneously taking an objective and impartial and, if you like, even-handed view. I don't know. What do you think, George?
That presupposes Labour has won a general election in order to do all of that. It's my case that the policy they've adopted makes the likelihood of them winning a general election dramatically less, massively less. And therefore, my first complaint about the policy is that it makes a Labour defeat in the election much more likely. And because I don't want Labour to be defeated in the election, I'm very sad and angry about that. But my second point is it's the opposite of implementing the will of the people, because the will of the people has already been expressed. And Labour is opposing the implementation of the will of the people by forcing them to vote again, which, irrespective of how I think they will vote, as a matter of principle, as a matter of democratic principle, is an abomination. Because why should they have to vote again? They've already voted. And it's the politician's job to implement the outcome that the people already voted for. Adam, what's your take on that?
Well, I've seen so much mental gymnastics surrounding this Labour conference that it's almost more exciting than the boxing matches. I mean, it really is like the Brighton Olympics, which is maybe it's more exciting than the Mods and Rockers in many ways. The violence, the intrigue,
down
the
in Brighton, yes,
dagger.
where it used to happen.
Indeed. And so, but where the Who did a quadrophenia about it, this is really more of a zero-sum game. I'm going to say something, I'm going to make it clear. Labour are a party of Remain. Labour are a party of Remain. Labour are a party of Remain. And I don't care how much linguistic contortions that Labour's true believers say, there's only, frankly, one difference between the Labour Brexit position and the Liberal Democrat Brexit position, and that's that Jo Swinson, for all her shrieking, is at least being honest that a vote for the Liberal Democrats will be a vote to instantly cancel Brexit. A vote for Labour will be a vote to cancel Brexit with even more contorting and confusion and duplicity and infighting. It really, frankly, is absolutely absurd.
Well, there you go. James Ball, BSc, LLB, MA, he's a councillor too. He says, Adam, as a Marxist, I've increasingly find myself agreeing with old conservative enemies like David Starkey on many social issues and Brexit, but not everything. Would you agree that this is due to our mutual hatred of the liberal media stroke political class? What a very good question. No wonder you've got all these letters after your name, James.
Quite so. Very well. It reminds me of this Monty Python sketch, which I'm sure can be looked up online, and as the BBC have taken it down, where John Cleese is a doctor with so many titles after his name that there's a little board that goes around the room. But in this case, very well. No, absolutely. And we can even go back to before Marxism really became popular in Britain, the way that it did in some quarters in the early 20th century. In the late 19th century, it was remarked by a man called MacDonald. His Christian name slips my mind, but he was one of the first Labour members of Parliament, and he talked about how Disraeli's Tory government did more for the working class than decades of Whig and Liberal rule. I think that one thing that ties the patriotic left in with the traditional right, which is very different than the neocon right, who just stole the Liberals' bath clothes while they were in the tub, the thing that ties them together is that their politics can only survive if it's tied to the land, to the culture, to the institutions. And one area where I will very much agree with the left is I think the greatest institution of any nation is its people. For liberals, people don't matter. Ideas matter. Feelings matter. And all of this stuff is going to be legislated by the government at your expense, no matter how much industry is closed, no matter how many taxes on the air that I breathe, the Hollies would be taxed out of existence. Some will get the reference. And so absolutely, the patriotic left and the traditional conservative side of things should work together when possible. They should respect each other when impossible. And I think that Brexit, if it's to be carried forward, needs to be carried forward in just that capacity.
Sherlocked asks Adam, do you think that democratic system is the solution to every political problem? Do you think that imposing a democratic system in Pakistan is a rational thing to do, given the nature of the Pakistani people? Wow.
Well, there's not the democratic system. There are as many interpretations of democracy as the day is long. The problem in Pakistan isn't the political system. The problem is one of a political culture that has yet to divorce itself from feudalism, and frankly, both of the main old parties are guilty men in that respect. PTI, while not perfect, are important because they appear to be breaking that link with a feudal mentality, which is absolutely necessary for any modern system of governance to be successful, whether democratic or anti-democratic. So I think that whilst feudalism and tribalism and political dynasties are a problem in many countries, Pakistan being just one, I think to blame the parliamentary style of democracy as a system is wrong, because look at Singapore. That has a parliamentary system, and it's in many ways still the shining hope of development for a nation country that went from nothing in economic terms to everything in economic terms.
And yet Mrs. Merkel raises the possibility of us becoming like Singapore as something to scare us with, a kind of Halloween monster.
Well, I think Mrs. Merkel should get down on her hands and knees, not take it any further, she's not Miss Lewinsky, but she should apologise to Britain and apologise to Singapore, because she's saying that Singapore, perhaps the greatest ever post-colonial success story ever told, is somehow something to shun, something to be afraid of. Frankly, if the European gangsters are afraid of Britain becoming like Singapore, that is the best endorsement for Brexit. Singapore is always on the top of the world league tables for education, low crime, high development, good environmental standards. They solved the housing shortage much better, for example, than Hong Kong, in spite of having a very compact area. And of course there'll be various people, and I know which side of the political spectrum they're on, so I won't give them the moment of fame by glorifying where they're coming from, but they'll point out that, oh, Singapore has this wrong and that wrong. Every country has things wrong, but Singapore is an immense story of success, and one that owes itself to Lee Kuan Yew's fascination with both the pros and cons of the British system. So if Britain can become more like a country formed by Lee Kuan Yew and less like the Germany being destroyed by Angela Merkel, I say bring it on.
Nadine, welcome.
Hello. Hi, George, and hi, Adam.
Hi there.
I was pleased to comment on two subjects that were mentioned in today's episode. But first of all, I would like to thank you for your coverage of Palestine and Israel with two great interviews today with Gideon Levy and 2 weeks ago with Nico Peled.
Yeah. Two great Israelis.
Yes, exactly. Two great Israelis, very brave. The first subject that I'd really like to ask your opinion about is the topic of the type of Islamist movements that we've seen since the birth of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. And you've mentioned them today and also in other episodes where you describe how they are a natural, or this type of Islamism is a natural extremist reaction to Western foreign policy. But I've always felt like there's something not quite right about looking at them as a natural or an organic movement, because at the time that they've emerged in Afghanistan, and then after that, especially leading up to 9/11, there was really nothing particularly new or bad about Western policy in comparison of how it was, say, at the time that Palestine was colonized. I mean, there was. If you look at the year 2000, it was pretty slightly positive for the Middle East. The fact that Lebanon was liberated by Hezbollah. So when I look at Al Qaeda and what happened in 9/11, it just seems to me like there's no organic or logical explanation to explain how they came about or why they chose to attack the West at that particular time. It seems to be most likely they continue to be an arm of hidden. There's a hidden arm behind them ever since they came out of Afghanistan.
Yeah, well, look, just because of the hour, Nadine, I have to cut you short because this is a very serious question you raise. We will try to do our best in the time available to discuss it, but maybe we need to put it on as an item on the show on its own. I hear what you say. I've heard it before. It is to some extent true in my belief. There's no doubt that some Islamist currents and trends have an arm behind them. It doesn't mean that they would not have existed in the real world. doesn't mean that they are not organic, but they have undoubtedly been helped. If I give just two examples, though I could give many more, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt was directly facilitated by British colonialism and later US colonialism as a cat's paw, as a termite within the timbers of the Arab Republic being built by President Nasser. In my view, the greatest of all Arab leaders. His thesis was that the Arabs were one, Shab Arabi Wahid, one Arab people, from the Atlantic to the Gulf, from Marrakesh to Bahrain. This was very dangerous to colonialism, to imperialism. So how to combat President Nasser's message? Let's put money and other assistance into the Muslim Brotherhood. I'll give you a second one, which is a bit more sensitive, and I don't usually like to talk about it. But I was, for many decades, a comrade of President Arafat. May God have mercy upon him. President Arafat was the leader of an Arab nationalist movement for the liberation of Palestine. How to defeat him? Well, thought Israel, one way we could do it is to take a leaf out of the British colonial book in Egypt and stimulate the growth of an Islamist tendency within the Palestinian people, and hey presto, you got Hamas. Now, I was there. I was there when it happened, in Gaza, when nothing else could move. No Palestinian resistance movement could move. When the jails were full, the graveyards were full of the cadre of all the other Palestinian organizations. But Hamas, or what became Hamas, was openly able to move, driving around their minibuses, opening their kindergartens, opening their clinics and other social outreach work. Now, I am not saying, not for 1 minute, saying that the people in Hamas were traitors or were a fiction or any of that. I'm not saying that. But I am saying that Israel played a very important role in the development of Hamas. But they did not do so because they loved Islam. They did not do so because they loved the Palestinian Muslims in Gaza. They did so to weaken Arafat, to weaken the PLO, and thus strengthen Israel. Adam, over to you.
Well, as we've discussed previously, if the Arabs from the Atlantic to the Gulf were a single entity, as they were before, under both the rule of Arab caliphates and under the relatively unmolested rule of Turkish caliphates, because in many ways the Turks were the Romans to the Greeks that were the Arabs at that point in the history of that region, and well, multiple regions really. If the Arab world became a sovereign republic or confederation today, it would be one of the largest countries in the world with just about every resource that one could imagine. They would be at the top table with the US, with China, with Russia, with whichever country in Europe has the least bad recession, which, hey, is probably Brexit Britain, Mrs. Merkel yet again hoist on her own petard. But just to sum it up, I say this to Arab people, both in the real world and on that psychotic Disneyland called Twitter, and they'll come up with every excuse possible. Oh, there's a different way of pronouncing an obscure rice dish in Morocco than there is in Oman. Therefore, we can't unite. With that kind of psychological contortionism, frankly, they all ought to join the Labour Party.
Nadine, sorry if we didn't do justice to your very important call. I promise you we will return to this. Thanks for that call from Montreal. Let's go to Kassif in Leeds. Go ahead, Kassif.
Yes, hello, George. I just wanted your opinion on the fact that the Labour Party has declared that they want to outlaw public schools, sell off their land and their buildings, and Diane Abbott, who is behind this policy, herself sent her children to public schools.
Yes. Well, given the hour, I can't really go into too great detail on this, but I've got the news that has just broken. Labour will campaign at the next general election with a promise to effectively abolish private schools and redistribute their properties to the state sector. Party members backed the move at Labour's conference in Brighton on Sunday, which activists hailed as a huge step forward in dismantling the privilege of a tiny Eton-educated elite. In a motion approved through a vote by delegates at Labour's conference, they resolved that the party should commit to integrate all private schools into the state sector in their next election manifesto. They would also campaign to withdraw the charitable status and all other public subsidies and tax privileges, including business rate exemptions, from private schools. Raising the prospect of private schools' buildings and playing fields being taken from their control, the motion added endowments, investments and properties held by private schools to be redistributed democratically and fairly across the country's educational institutions. Adam, your thoughts on that?
I'm literally holding back the laughter, because if the Brexit decision wasn't bad enough, this is them shooting themselves in the other foot. Let me explain why, because it might not be so obvious. Most people, I would say, in the UK, especially after a pint of something that isn't water, tend to call people who went to public schools by four-letter words. At the same time, as you rightly said earlier in this show, Britain isn't a country that likes revolutions. Most people would say that they want the local state schools to have quality that at least approaches these vaunted public schools and other schools in the private sector. But the idea of abolishing institutions and seizing their assets just isn't going to sell well in this country, because even though people from public schools have a certain reputation amongst people who didn't go to public schools, the average person will be thinking, well, one day they're going to abolish that, then what next? The established church, the parliament, the monarchy, the ability... It just goes... People in this country aren't really disestablishment inclined. They very much want to see a traditional Labour Party that wants to build up and strengthen the public's, the state-owned schools, state-operated schools, but the idea that they're going to seize the assets of Eton with people in the tailcoats, I don't know, screaming, and I mean, you could really, I mean, someone call Elvis Costello. They need to rewrite, he needs to rewrite Eton Rifles only with Diane Abbott on backing vocals, and Jeremy Corbyn can shake his green tambourine.
Well, let me run one thing past you. One of the parts of the motion, I haven't seen the motion, by the way. That's Sky News's spin on what has been decided tonight. I'll wait until I actually read it properly before commenting at any length. But it is absurd that Eton, one of the richest institutions in the country, can be a charity and get charitable exemptions, rate rebates, and that donations to it can be treated as donations to charity. Now, I have been to Eton many times as a speaker. I quickly add not to be educated. I was educating them.
Quite so.
And there's no doubt of what you get, what you pay for. If you pay to go to Eton, it's at least 30,000, maybe 40 now. In fact, it is, I think, 40,000 per child, per term, per year. It's serious money, especially if you've got more than one child.
Quite so.
But it ain't a charity. It's ridiculous to call it a charity. So at the very minimum, public schools should lose their charitable status, don't you think?
In theory, I agree, and in practice, I think it would be difficult, because what that would mean in practice is the price to get one's child in would be so high that no one in this country could go. It would be the princes of various throat-chopping dictatorships, since China's a very much wealthier country now than
a lot of Chinese kids are at Eton.
Quite so, and that's a good thing.
And Russian kids.
And those are all good things, don't get me wrong. But I do think that if you price local people out of a business, and I do think that schools that are owned privately or businesses, if you price them out of that, if you price local people out, it's not a good thing. So in theory, I agree that everyone should be taxed the same. If I just start to sell Adam's House of cigarettes and Diet Cola, I shouldn't get any tax breaks, and nor should Eton. Practically, though, I think that it would price people in this country out.
But here's another thought which comes off that point. I believe, in the right of Catholic parents to send their children to Catholic schools.
Absolutely, same here.
There is a real danger that if the political class is in the business of abolishing types of schools, that this will be raised. Jewish schools, Muslim schools, Catholic schools. Kasif, what's your view?
Why kill the cow when one can milk the cow? I mean, just put a VAT on them, and all the primary school children can get fed. And also, if they abolish public schools, then these elites will end up going to Swiss schools and American schools, like Le Rosé. So they will go to schools, but it won't be in the UK, it'll be in Europe then.
Okay, Kasif, thank you very much indeed. We'll have to return to this subject too. It's a very, very big one.
MOATS is free, by the way.
Yeah.
That's my favourite school.
This is neither a private school nor a public school. It's an open university of the airwaves, and you can attend it entirely for free. Red Robbo says, interesting observation by Adam Garrie on Michael Foote and libertarian socialism. Indeed, it is interesting. There are so many, Adam. I'm sorry I can't get through them all. I'm sorry to the people who sent them in that we haven't been able to get through them all, and also those that have been trying to get through on the phone and haven't been able to get their call to air. But that's because of the success of the show. That's because so many people are now listening, calling, tweeting, and otherwise communicating with the mother of all talk shows. You can see us live in Liverpool in October, in East Kilbride in January, and you can see me live speaking about China next Saturday evening at 7 o'clock in the Bolivar Hall. You'll know it because of the huge Venezuelan flag flying from the flagpole there in Fitzrovia in London, just off Tottenham Court Road. Well, it's been marvellous for me. I hope it was for you. And if it was, I hope you'll come back next week at the same time, to the same place, or additional places. Stand by for important new developments on that. We'll be everywhere, God willing, by next Sunday.